So that's basically the simplest way I can answer your question of, was I an anxious child? Anxiety didn't even have a chance to come into it. It was all about surviving the day-to-day of this groundhog. As soon as I hit puberty, it was like, okay, now I need to find out who I am outside of these people. And that's basically when the anxiety started kicking in, because I had escaped. So yeah, as a child, it was just about, smiling and getting on with it. But in a way, it taught me to be who I am today. Exactly. From things as simple as being a child and watching the adults around you, you watch them be rude to waiters, for example, in a restaurant. And I just remember thinking, like, that's not right. Why are you being rude to the waiter? A, you're not going to get what you want by being rude to them. B, you're making them upset because you think you're better than them. And I know you're not better than them because I know that you're evil and broken. And I think all that informed my own interaction with the world and the way that, I am able to be a good interviewer, and the way that I genuinely have so much empathy to tell other people's stories, that kind of thing. So any anxiety as a child I quickly projected onto other people to take the spotlight off myself. Who knows? It's funny because, when you look at people's childhoods, they always say it's one of two things. Like, there's nature and there's nurture. And then supposing you're raised by a terrible role model, you either mimic them or you completely do the opposite. Who knows why I did the opposite? I just remember from a very young age disliking the people in charge of me and knowing that I didn't want to be anything like them, and that there must be a world where people aren't like that. And I don't know, I very much just lived inside my own head and developed my own code, ethical code and values by which to live by. And who knows, I'm grateful to myself that I was able to do that. I probably wouldn't be here doing this job if I had had an easy life. Do you know what I mean? I would have probably gone down the route of all the other women in my family who are just like trophy wives, basically. I'm the only woman in my family with a formal education. I'm the only person who's been independent financially since I was 17, really. So yeah, none of that would have happened if I'd had an easy ride. I probably would have married someone rich and been on my third divorce by now. Yeah, I mean, I pretty much had the typical extreme rebellion situation. So as soon as I hit puberty, they say when you hit puberty, that's when you kind of become who you really are, if you haven't had the chance to already. And I suddenly, you're a teenager and all your senses are firing, and I became deeply curious about the world because I just was like, I need to get out of this banal kind of Stepford Wives existence where people were aspirational about money and appearance. That just didn't interest me. I became very interested in alternative music, and I would start hanging out at the skate park, talking to boys, smoking cigarettes, whatever. But it got really extreme, because I was still having big problems with my caregivers. So I ran away. I got a boyfriend who lived in a squat, and I went and lived with him. I went to university. I dropped out a couple of times because I was just heavily depressed. I basically got into a crisis, in finding myself. I fell into bad circles. I basically started taking any drug I could get my hands on. And that was the way it was for a few years, trying to finish university, being depressed, taking loads of drugs. I also, at that time, became a semi-professional DJ because my life was so nocturnal and I loved music, and that was my escape, basically. And then I picked up Vice magazine. But I was so depressed. I was working full-time in a bar and DJing a lot. And I had taken a summer off and gone to visit my dad, who was living in France. Didn't take any drugs for a few months. Came back, spoke to a friend who worked at Vice and was like, can I start writing for the magazine? And they were like, yeah. And I started writing for the magazine, got the job, and that's literally when my life started to get better. my identity is so weaved in with Vice, with this place. It gave me like a kind of lifeline, and it gave me something to do and focus on other than myself and my problems. And in terms of trying to find out who I was, suddenly I had a platform for who I was, and my ideas translated into words and ideas and films. And I have basically never felt the way I did again. I mean, I've struggled with new forms of depression, new mental health challenges, but that kind of terrible teenage doom was lifted. I was lifted out of it by getting the job at Vice. I'd show up at Vice, I'd get there before my boss because I was desperate to get a job there. I was an intern, so I'd show up before he got there. I'd make everyone cups of tea. I was always going beyond the call of duty. And then, at 6 o'clock, I'd jump on my bicycle and frantically cycle to the bar where I worked and did a shift, until like 2 a.m. And then I'd be back at Vice the next day. I was working probably like 90 hours a week or something, but I didn't care because I really had this sense of like, this makes me feel alive. This is a lifeline. Like all this like intense anxiety and like depression and nightmare going on in my head can be streamlined and used and channeled if I can just use it in this intellectual way. I just knew it, and luckily it worked out. Yeah, because I feel like I owe this place my life. And that's not, I don't stay here because I owe them something. I'm in an emotional relationship with this place. It's like my family. Okay, so I suppose the most helpful way to talk about it is, I spent most of my 20s working my arse off, doing my dream job, flying around the world, never taking vacation, never taking days off because I didn't want to do anything but my job. I loved it. Vice was everything. But I'd also had no room in my life for relationships. Okay, so I was just working, and I was the girl. Okay, this is a really lame analogy, but if your friendship group is the women in Sex and the City, I was fucking Samantha. Okay, I wasn't sexually promiscuous in that way, but I was the one who was don't let boys hurt you. They're dogs. They would ask me for guy advice, right? And I'd be like, don't text him, don't fall in love, don't have feelings for men. That way you can't get hurt. The reason I was like that was because of my childhood. So I'd never had any emotional intimacy with anybody, even my friends, because that was how I'd learnt to protect myself from harm, by not feeling. But as I reached the end of my 30s, and I was like, what am I doing with my life? I want to see if it's possible for me to have feelings for a man. I had casual relationships with them, but I'd never really, really been in love, really. And so I challenged myself, and I met someone, and I fell in love, really, for the first time in my life. And I really thought, my God, I've won the lottery. I've got my dream job, my dream boyfriend. I know what the rest of my life is going to look like. Then, long story short, that relationship fell apart. I lost it. I had a complete breakdown, basically. I fell into complete crisis and became very, very sick. I basically had suicidal ideations, which if you had told me that even the year before, I would have laughed in your face. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to experience feelings of suicide. I couldn't imagine. It would be imagine you're a horse. That was how far away I was from someone who could ever imagine wanting to kill themselves. Suddenly, I found myself in a situation where I wanted to die. So my friends and family rallied around me, and they were like, we need to do something. And so I went on a mental health journey. I started taking antidepressants and trying to get healthy. And it was the best decision I ever made. Moved to America, which is also a place where mental health conversations aren't as taboo as they are in the UK. I was brought up to have a stiff upper lip. It's a very British way of being. Depression was not acknowledged as anything real, and so it was a great relief to me to come here, where I still live. And so that's been really helpful for me. I've come here, I have amazing therapist, psychiatrist, psychologist. I take 2 different forms of medication. I meditate, and I'm in the best shape of my life. Mentally. Because, self-care we talk about these days, and it's about like eating natural. And I think maybe people equate like pharmaceutical drugs with like recreational drugs. I don't know why, but for me, and again, I was one of those people who thought that it was shameful and that I failed in some way if I had to kind of rely on this type of medical intervention to help me. But in a way, accepting that these things could help me was important. And I think this is true of everybody, because I always would laugh off, oh, I had a fucked up childhood. But to be able to say, look, you really, really survived something incredibly awful. And to the extent that you need to take pills, and that is okay. Like, you're doing something good for yourself. And it's okay to say, like, you suffered and it was awful. And, you know, you should be proud. And the way I was treated as a child was unnatural. Pills are unnatural. Like, what are you going to do? My biggest fear. I suppose my biggest fear would be somehow going back to a place where I felt suicidal again, honestly. I don't know if it's like plates spinning and I think about it every day. Like, am I happy because I have a nice boyfriend? Am I happy because I've still got a job? Am I happy because I still have my health? Like, and what if those things went away? Would I be plunged into a state of desperation again? Am I enough for myself without all these external... Will I have to always outsource my happiness to other people in order to not want to kill myself, kind of thing, if that makes sense? So, yeah, I would say I do fear, because once your brain has gone to that dark place, it's like Pandora's box, and it's always there. It never really goes away. And even though I would describe myself as lucky and happy, and I'm glad I've gone through everything I've gone through because it's made me the truest version of myself and the most authentic version of myself, I would hate to be suicidal again. That's my biggest fear. If a good friend asked me, I would say to my best friend, yes, you're enough for yourself. So I'm going to say, yes, I am enough for myself, even if I don't believe it all the time. I think that is ultimately what we all should be striving for every day. So I'm going to say yes, because it's a good vibe.